Good morning, everyone. This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University. Thanks for joining another installment of our series, Understanding Our New World. And today we're really delighted to be joined by a terrific guest, Dame Louise Richardson, who is president of the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Let me tell you a little bit about Dame Richardson. She is a native of Ireland. She has an undergraduate degree from Trinity College in Dublin, a master's in political science from UCLA, and a doctorate from Harvard University. She taught at Harvard for about 20 years or so, was a terrific teacher. I actually had a friend who took one of her classes and said she was amazing. She went on to, and actually while she was at Harvard teaching, she developed a real expertise in terrorism and wrote an important book in 2006 called What Terrorists Want: Understanding the Enemy, Containing the Threat. I might add that her course was very popular in the 1990s before, terrorism was the focus of many policymakers. Ms. Richardson then went on to serve as executive dean of Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies. And then she was vice chancellor of the University of St. Andrews in Scotland from 2009 to 2016, and then the vice chancellor of Oxford from 2016 to 2022. I might add, in the UK, a vice chancellor is effective the president or chancellor in our system. So she was effectively the leader of both of those universities and became the 13th president of the Carnegie Corporation in January of 2023. The Carnegie Corporation is one of the leading foundations in the world, doing some really important work in peace and security, education, and democracy. So we're looking forward to a really wide-ranging and interesting interview. She is joining us from her office in New York City. So Dame Richardson, good morning, and thank you for being with us.
Good morning, John. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, let's start out with your background in Ireland. You're the second oldest of seven, and I heard you say you're the first in your family to go to college. And I heard you say in an interview that being one of seven taught you skills of negotiation and compromise. Tell us a little bit about growing up in Ireland and coming from a big family like that.
Well, I was enormously privileged to grow up in a little seaside town where we were related to absolutely everybody. Everybody knew you and knew who you belonged to. But being one of seven, I think, was one of the formative experiences of my life, in the sense that you're never the center of the universe. Your siblings let you away with nothing. So you constantly have to negotiate. And also, as one of the older kids, you're responsible for the younger ones. And so while I haven't chosen to have seven children myself, I'm very glad to have grown up as one of a large family. I would say growing up in rural Ireland, being one of seven, wasn't in any sense unusual. I have many friends from bigger families than that.
Well, I heard you talk about birth order. I know you're the second oldest of seven. I'm the second oldest of six. So we maybe have some things in common, but talk about the birth order reference you once made.
Well, an MIT academic wrote a very interesting book in which he argued that all the great revolutionary leaders of throughout history were what he called later-borns, and all the conservative leaders were firstborns. And you can understand this because firstborn is the beneficiary, and then the later-borns come and disrupt the status quo. Now, he didn't differentiate between firstborn and later-born. He didn't I think the dynamics are very different if you're one of two versus one of 10. But the psychologists, however, say that when in a large family, when the second child is a girl, which was the case in mine, the eldest is a boy, the girl very often acquires many of the attributes normally associated with a firstborn, like a hyper-developed sense of responsibility and so on. And they call it the functional firstborn. And I'm afraid I think I fell into this category, although it annoys my brother when I point it out.
Well, as your story goes, you're 17 years old and you're off to Trinity College in Dublin. And as I've understand the story, you were actually hitchhiking to school. So as you were, hitchhiking to Dublin, apart from hoping a ride comes pretty soon, I mean, what was going through your mind? I mean, was it a kind of a mix of apprehension and excitement? What were you thinking?
Oh, I was hugely excited. And yes, I only traveled by hitchhike. I mean, we had absolutely no money in those days. So the idea of being able to pay for a bus or a train, just wasn't a possibility. So hitchhiking was how you got around. And then if anybody was driving up to Dublin, anytime my father drove up, the car was filled with local kids who needed a lift to Dublin. So, and I would say, while I would never have allowed, not that I could have prevented, but would never have allowed, if I could, my children from hitchhiking. In all my years doing it in Ireland, it was completely safe and met lots of interesting people. So I went up to Dublin hugely excited. It was going to be the first time I was ever in a classroom with boys, and that was pretty exciting. And Dublin seemed like an amazing place. Now, once I got there, I was socially very much out of my depth because most of the kids there were not like me. The Catholic Church banned Catholics from attending Trinity until about 1970, just a few years before I went there. Trinity actually admitted Catholics in the 1780s, but the Catholic Church didn't want Catholics going to what was called the Godless College. So socially it was very different. Most of my classmates were Protestant and knew one another because they'd been to the same handful of private schools, whereas I'd obviously been to the local convent. So it was, probably culturally the biggest shift I've ever made, notwithstanding the fact that I've moved back and forth across the Atlantic multiple times.
Well, and then Trinity, I mean, you've described it as a transformative experience in terms of just being presented with kind of a different narrative of Irish history. So let's talk about that piece. And then also just the kind of the responsibility. I think you were working 2 jobs, in the morning in the library, the evening as a cocktail waitress. So talk about both dimensions, both the kind of academic challenge and the kind of new worldview that you were exposed to, and then also just the importance of work to support your education.
Well, I grew up in a very homogeneous environment. We all learned the same version of Irish history. We all learned that England was the evildoer responsible for all of Ireland's ills. That's what we learned at school. That's what we gathered at school every morning for assembly underneath a crucifix and a picture of the Proclamation of Independence and the photographs of the 7 men who were executed for signing it. So we had a very a view of Irish history that none of us challenged until I got to Trinity, where most of my professors were actually English, and they had I learned an entirely different version of the same historical events, and that really fascinated me. How 2 sets of people, my teachers, my family, and then my professors, all wonderful people, could have diametrically opposed interpretations of the same historical events. And when I would go home and challenge some of the verities that we grew up with, I remember my mother saying, "Oh, that's just Trinity talk." So, but that was so mind-opening for me, realizing that there were very different ways on this tiny little island of interpreting the same events. As to working, I mean, you make it sound onerous, but it really wasn't really, or I didn't feel it was. I worked shelving books in the library from 8 to 10, 6 mornings a week, because the libraries didn't open till 10. And then 4 nights a week, I worked as a cocktail waitress. And so because I paid my own way through university, and of course the fees were such that through working in the holidays and in the summer, I could earn enough to pay tuition. And then so I had the jobs so to fund myself, pay my rent, fund my social life, and so on. And I still managed to have a pretty full social life because I worked from 6 to 12, so the real parties got going after the pub shut. So I would just change out of my cocktail waitress clothes onto my bicycle and cycle to wherever the party was on. So I never felt it was particularly onerous or anything.
Another big kind of mind shift occurred a couple years later when you won a Rotary Fellowship. We talked about that before, to go to school in California. And talk about that. I mean, that must have been a whole different world for you for a lot of Americans, going to California is a little bit of a mind shift. So certainly from your experience, it must have been something quite remarkable. Talk about that, if you would, please.
Well, it really was amazing. And it came about, I was up in Dublin, my first year at Trinity, and I saw a little advertisement in the Irish Times for this fellowship. And I said, I really should apply for that. It would give me good experience competing against my much smoother classmates and contemporaries. And I did it purely for the experience of the competition. And nobody was more surprised than I was when I actually won the thing. But when you applied, you had to say where you'd like to go. And I know you won a Rotary too, so you may remember this. There were a few constraints, no more than 3 in one country. And I saw that and I thought, well, I really only speak French and English good enough to conduct to take classes. So I put down the University of the Sorbonne, the University of Geneva, and I thought, well, America, I've got to put some American places down. And then we had this ancient World Book Encyclopedia at home. I'll always remember when my father bought it. We got it secondhand, and it was a very big deal to have it in the house. And so I looked up American universities. So I looked up the ones I'd heard of. I looked up Harvard, and it said men only. And so it didn't mention Radcliffe. It was a very old encyclopedia. Since then, Harvard had become co-ed, but I didn't know that. So I thought, sugar, I can't put down Harvard, can't put down Yale, which was also listed as co-ed. For some reason, Georgetown wasn't. And then there was a photograph of Newport Beach, California, and this new university, the University of California. And I said, California, sunshine, beaches, that's for me. So I put that one down. And again, I did all this just for the experience. So then I won the scholarship, and they said they wanted me to go to Newport Beach, California, because nobody had been there before. And so I had the most extraordinary time. I would say that I had to go see the head of my department, a very formidable academic called T.W. Moody, to ask for permission to go. So he gave me permission, but he would not give me any credit for any course I would take at the University of California. That as far as he was concerned, modernity began in 1600. So something in California was not going to get any credit from his department. So I said, fine. And then he said, in order to return, you're going to have to take the exams of the students. So I had to take a year off, but then take the same exams before I'd be allowed back into the third year of the students who had been the second year. So I had to come back from my year in America and sit the exams in the classes I hadn't been in order to get permission to re-enter. So it cost me a year, and that was very liberating because I didn't have to worry about credit. So I took all kinds of courses and things that I would never have been able to. One of the mistakes I made in applying to Trinity, again, I didn't know what I was doing as a student. I knew I liked history. I knew I liked political science, politics. So Trinity had a course called History and Political Science, and that's what I applied for, and that's what I was admitted to. What I didn't know, that was actually pure history, 2 years of solid medieval history, nothing but medieval history, 2 years of modern began in 1600, and just one political science course, political theory, political philosophy course. Again, had I been to a school that normally sent kids to Trinity, I'd have known that. So I found myself very constrained, not taking the courses I would have wanted at university. So I go to California and I can take anything. And that was just fabulous. I studied international relations. I studied a course on violence in the media, Italian fascism, all kinds of wonderful courses that I would never have been able to study. So again, I resolved that I was come hell or high water, I was going to get back to America. So I returned to Trinity, graduated, and then won another scholarship back to UCLA to get a master's degree.
Right. And then you went to Harvard and you studied under a really remarkable professor, Stanley Hoffman.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about both your graduate work at Harvard and then the transition to teaching there.
Well, Stanley Hoffman, if anybody listening has ever read his work or know of him, was just the most extraordinary man. And I felt enormously privileged to have, well, first he was my teacher, then he became my colleague and a dear friend, and in fact was godfather to my son. Stanley was a foreign-born Jew in France. He was Austrian-born. His mother was a secular Jew. They moved to France. They were in Paris as the Nazis were coming. And he ended up spending the war in occupied in Vichy France in hiding. And he, I think, spent the rest of his life trying to understand the cataclysm that had befallen Europe and how to ensure that it would never happen again. He was quite brilliant and extraordinarily erudite. And so I took many courses from him. I asked him if he would advise my dissertation, which he did. He was very much of the old school. He was not a hands-on advisor. I remember giving him 145 pages of my thesis, so the first couple of chapters, and left them off at his office and heard nothing. So I was walking through the yard and bumped into him. And he said, "Ah, yes, I won't try to emulate his wonderful French accent. Yes, I've read your chapters. You can collect them from Jacqueline, his assistant." So I hightailed it over to Jacqueline, got the pages back and went through them. And he had picked up 2 typos and there was nothing else written on them. And it was 145 pages. So I knew he'd read them because he'd picked up 2 typos. So I tracked him down and I said, so I received, he said, "Oh, did you collect your chapters?" I said, "Yes, but you didn't write anything on them." And he just said, "Oh, I don't believe in giving faint praise." And that was it. So I thought, okay, I guess I just carry on. But he was his insight, and he brought together the mind of a historian, a cultural critic. I mean, he saw every film that was out and read a lot of literature. So it was a real old school political science. He used to joke that he was considered a dinosaur in the government department we were in, that he'd never be hired, much less tenured today, because he brought a real breadth of perspective. He was a wonderful, wonderful man. Of course, transitioning from being a student to being an academic in the same institution is not for the faint-hearted. I mean, you worry that you will always be seen as a student. I was affiliated with the Center for International Affairs as an undergraduate, as a graduate student. So I moved my affiliation to the Center for European Studies once I became a faculty member. But like at the time, I was married by the time I got my PhD, and we had personal reasons. My husband's parents were both very ill, so I didn't want to move away from Boston. So, I think ordinarily it makes sense to switch institutions, but for kind of personal reasons, I opted not to. And of course, Harvard is a fabulous place. You get to meet extraordinary colleagues, brilliant, motivated students, and you have fascinating people are passing through all the time. So I feel very indebted to the place for the quality of my education and the opportunities it made available to me. And of course, I only went through there on scholarship. So again, I feel profoundly grateful for that.
And the class you taught on terrorism, I understand that it was something that you proposed, and maybe this is a little bit about how universities work. The fact that it was very popular and kind of in high demand made some feel a little nervous or uneasy, maybe jealous. I mean, well, maybe more the substance of the terrorism class, but also just how the work you had to do to get it, permitted to be presented.
Well, I used to teach courses on American foreign policy for the most part and international security, and with students in my office seeing all my books said, "How come all your books are on terrorism and all your courses are on foreign policy?" And I said, "Oh, that's just my hobby," because growing up in Ireland, there was real sympathy towards the IRA. And when I got to America and read the literature on terrorism, I thought it was very weak. They saw terrorists as one-dimensional bad guys and psychopaths, and I thought it's much more complicated than that. So I read a lot of work on it. So anyway, these students seeing my books said, "Why don't you teach a class?" And I said, "All right, I'll do a junior honor seminar next term." And so these courses were limited in size to 12, usually had half a dozen students. And the idea was the one opportunity for students at Harvard to have small group interaction with a faculty member. So I offered it the next term, and 133 students signed up. And I was expecting 6. So in order to prevent a riot, I said, okay, tell you what, I'll teach a lecture course next year. And as you know, there's nothing like teaching a lecture course to force you to clarify your thinking. So I was a little worried that it might be very popular. So I made it not fulfilling any requirements. We met 3 times a week, not 2. I made it, I wanted serious kids to come take it. And we had about 170, which for a course which really didn't fulfill requirements was huge. So yes, some of my colleagues, of course, didn't like the fact that I was stealing their students, A, and B, there was this notion that she's just being a populist, she's getting all these kids. This can't be serious. But the students were very serious, and the courses were very serious, and I loved teaching them. And as I say, smart students really force you to clarify your thinking on complex subjects, and I love that.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your work in academic administration. We could spend a whole hour plus on it. I mean, at Radcliffe and then at St. Andrews and at Oxford. And was academic administration something that you some opportunities came up and you saw that you both liked it and were good at it, or was this part of kind of a larger plan, or how did that all develop?
Well, I have to tell you, never in my wildest dreams did I ever imagine being vice-chancellor of the University of Oxford, or indeed St. Andrews. Relatively early in my career, Bob Cohane was the chair of the department, and his wife had been president of Wellesley and became president of Duke. And relatively early on, he said to me, Louise, you should think about, I think you would make a very good university president. And he appointed me to various administrative roles. I would say I had 3 children and 2 in-laws while I was a junior faculty member. So you become very good at juggling and managing lots of things at the same time. So so I took on these administrative roles, and I actually found them very satisfying, and they didn't take as much out of me as they took out of other people. I think some of my peers I saw who struggled in them, who agonized about every decision, and I was much more accustomed, I think, to juggling lots of things and being able to make decisions and staying clear-eyed about things. So I quite enjoyed the contrast between solving a problem. A student has a problem, you can solve it, but versus trying to figure out really complex issues. So I did enjoy the balance, and so I kept getting. Problem when you're good at something, as you know, in academia, you get a reputation for being a good administrator, and bigger jobs come your way. But that was fun.
I want to read a couple sentences of a speech you gave on universities and maybe have you reflect on that at the end. You say, universities will always be magical places for me. When I was a child growing up in rural Ireland in a family with 7 children, university really was a dream destination, a place where Cinderellas could dance with ideas from all over the world and return transformed, empowered to leave their old shoes behind and step into any profession they chose. University offered me a ticket into a new world, a social sphere not defined by religion or region, family income, race, or gender, a world that held out a different model of belonging, an expanded vision of my own possibilities. It also offered a newly complex and safely disputable vision of national history, politics, and international relations. And I know you've kind of joked when you were coming to Carnegie that you'd been in university since you were 17 years old. So just reflect on that for a second, if you would, Louise.
Well, and now that you read it back to me, I agree with every word in that. I love universities, and I'm very saddened by the fact that universities are going through a very difficult time as we speak in the summer of 2024 it is. But yes, I mean, I could never have achieved had enjoyed the experiences I've had if I hadn't had that first opportunity of going to university. And I loved the fact, and what's one of the things I loved when I came to university in America, that um, nobody cared what religion you were, or whether your parents were rich or poor. And the other real difference about American universities, which I loved, was in Ireland, and I think it's true in Britain too, it's not cool to be smart, especially not as a girl. And so, I would work pretty hard, but I would never reveal that I was working hard. So I'd often come, if it wasn't a weekend and I came home from working a late night shift, I would sit down and work. But you didn't advertise that or know that. I got to California and people worked really hard and were proud of how they worked. And I thought, geez, I don't have to hide the fact that I actually work hard. I really enjoy that. That's kind of liberating. People, I think, in California felt, you're here, of course you work hard. And so there was that culture of respecting hard work here, as opposed to denying it, that I liked. But that's a tangent. Universities just open so many possibilities and allow for, in my case, as I mentioned, to learn an entirely different version of the history I had grown up with. And to be able to engage in debate about that is just fantastic. It's fun.
Great. Well, let's talk about the Carnegie Corporation of New York, and maybe let's start out. We've some of our interviews for this series. We've had several people from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, based in D.C. In fact, one of our first guests was Bill Burns, who's now head of the CIA. But when we talked to him, he was head of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I know you were created in 1911, I think the endowment in 1910. So it seems like you're both branches from the same tree. Tell us a little bit about your mission and also maybe how it might differ from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace.
Well, Andrew Carnegie was the most extraordinary man. He emigrated from Scotland to the US, began life as a child laborer. He was a bobbin boy in a factory. Went on to become the richest man in the world. I mean, when he sold his steelworks, the price he got was 2% equivalent to 2% of US GDP. So staggeringly wealthy. But he had known poverty, and his parents were quite radical, actually. And he didn't feel he had any entitlement to this wealth. So he just resolved to give it all away during his lifetime. So a forerunner of the Giving Pledge, even today's Giving Pledge, is just to give more than 50% away. He resolved he was giving it all away. And so he created about north of 20 institutions altogether, the Carnegie Endowment being one of them. And actually, we were one of the later institutions, because he discovered he wasn't going to be able to give away all his money. So he gave the residue of his fortune to us. And then in his will, any money that was left would come to us as a foundation. And he said he didn't want to tie the hands of his successors, that we would be free to spend his money as we chose, whatever the need arose. He wanted to promote understanding between the people, knowledge and understanding amongst the people of the US. And so we have three areas that we support: peace, education, and strengthening democracy. But one of the things he did that I really love, and there's an Illinois link here, is he was self-educated. There was a local merchant who had a library who would allow the boys who worked in the factories borrow a book every week. And he used to go and borrow a book. And he wrote later in life about his excitement. This was the high point of his week, being able to get this book. And he'd spend the week reading it and thinking about what his next one would be. So he built in his lifetime 2,700 public libraries. Over 100 in Illinois, which is more than any other state other than, I think, California and Indiana. So I think about 106 libraries, free public libraries. They had to be free libraries, because he wanted to provide a ladder for people who wanted to educate themselves. So the Carnegie Endowment has evolved over time. Initially, he set it up with an endowment to fund their work, but they decided that they have morphed, if you like, into a think tank. And whereas we're a grant-giving body, the Carnegie Endowment is one of the main recipients of our funding because they do fabulous work. But there are others. They created the Hague Palace. There's when I was in Scotland, I was on the board of the Carnegie Trust for the Universities of Scotland. He remained very loyal and very generous to Scotland. So there are 20 odd, I think 22 total Carnegie institutions, some very tiny, some like us, quite big.
I saw an interview you did actually with Judy Woodruff at PBS just as you were starting this job. And one of Judy's questions to you was like, how do you start a job like this? And your answer was quite interesting. You said, I'm going to ask a lot of questions. And it reminded me of something I think Winston Churchill once said, which is, the key to leadership is probing, asking questions. Talk about just how you did begin to move. I know you'd been on the board, so you're quite familiar with the work of the Carnegie Corporation, but just, I guess, even as a management tool, the importance of asking questions and really fundamental questions that sort of challenge, just keep doing what had been done in the past.
Well, as my colleagues here will readily attest, I haven't stopped constantly asking questions. I'm still at it. Well, I think the main challenge for any philanthropy really is figuring out if you really have impact. So we're spending $200 million next year, or investing in various NGOs around the world, primarily in the US, but not exclusively. And how do we know that we're getting the results we want? We spend about 60 million a year more to support public education in this country. And I don't need to tell you that the state of public education in this country is dire given the wealth of the country. We're the largest private funder of work on US-Russia relations, US-China relations, nuclear security. All three of them are in worse shape today than they've been in a very long time. So, you constantly ask yourself, are we doing the right things? Are we having the impact we need to have? I feel an extraordinary privilege, but also a real sense of responsibility that we spend this money wisely. I care deeply about the things Carnegie cared about. We're in this privileged position to help people who also care about it. Are we helping the right people? Are we helping them do the right things? I mean, that's the fundamental problem with philanthropy. And I'm not completely convinced we've gotten it right yet. I mean, I think every single person we support is absolutely worthy of our support, but we're not having the impact I would like us to have. And I think most philanthropists and most foundations would probably say something quite similar.
I saw one interview in which you said, I think you were speaking more conceptually than literally. You said, I spend about half my day hearing about the hardest problems in the world and really kind of facing those. And then about half the day talking to some really amazing, creative people who are trying to solve these problems. And I'm trying to figure out how to kind of bring these two forces together.
Exactly. Reducing the delta between the two is what I see as my role. But the scale of the problems are enormous. And what gives you hope is the fact that there are so many extraordinary people out there trying to address them. But the scale is still pretty enormous.
Let's go through a couple of the programs just to kind of get a sense tangibly of what you do. I mean, the International Peace and Security Initiative, what are the main components of that?
Well, I mentioned work on US-Russia relations, US-China relations, nuclear security. I mean, one of the things that's really troubling about the nuclear field is all the polling suggests that young people, and if they're listening, are not terribly worried about nuclear weapons. They feel there'd be a technical solution. And I think we've, in some respects, after the Cold War, stopped worrying about nuclear weapons. And still, they're growing, they're proliferating. Countries are rapidly increasing their arsenals, and their deployment would be catastrophic. So we need to ensure that we understand them, that we fund a lot of programs that educate young people about nuclear weapons. We fund research on nuclear warfare. We're funding some initiatives by people who are trying to secure an international agreement to keep a human in the loop on the deployment of nuclear weapons. because with everything becoming so automated and with the growth of AI and generative AI, one could imagine a scenario in which nuclear weapons are deployed without human involvement, which would be a nightmare scenario. On a more positive note, we have a major program in Africa, mainly sub-Saharan Africa, supporting peace building and higher education in sub-Saharan Africa. There, the goal is to try to keep people on the continent, not to facilitate a brain drain, but to help build a vibrant research network amongst major universities there so that people opt to stay there. In response to the crisis in Ukraine, we have we're funding a number of initiatives to fund dislocated academics. This, of course, will be extended to people dislocated by the wars in the Middle East and indeed Africa as well. Again, ideally, we would like, rather than bringing Ukrainian or Russian dissident academics over to the US, help them stay broadly in the region so that when the war is finally over, they can more easily go back and help rebuild the universities and rebuild the societies so devastated by warfare. So we fund in the international sphere a raft of think tanks, raft of people trying to mediate between conflicts, just generally promoting international peace, and that gives lots of ground for lots of room there for work.
Right. Education. I know you're really concerned about public education in the US, but also, and related to that, civic education. I know that's a really increasingly important priority for you. Talk a little bit about the education initiatives.
Well, we are doubling down on libraries, actually, and libraries there as a means of providing education, especially for immigrants, for example, or people who want to, who dropped out of college and want to complete their degree, or kids in deprived areas in the afternoons. We're helping libraries provide programming for them. We fund all kinds of initiatives, education both for social and economic mobility and education for civic participation. So there's an organization called Civics, which promotes the teaching of civics in schools. We're funding the Khan Academy to come up with a curriculum on civics that would be available online. We're also funding a number of initiatives for community service. We believe that community service might give young people more of a feeling of belonging to their community, commitment to their community, if they were also investing in the community by spending time working with others, ideally providing an opportunity for interaction across race, region, and class, of which there aren't too many at the moment. I mean, since arriving at the corporation, I've taken the lens of polarization. I've been frankly appalled by the extent to which polarization has accelerated in this country in the 14 years I was living outside the country. I think, prior to the pandemic, Britain was fairly polarized. We see that with Brexit. Post the pandemic, I think Britain is much less polarized, and we've just seen a general election in Britain, and where the speeches by the outgoing and incoming prime ministers are just models of decorum and what a transfer of power in a democratic system should be like. Very different from what we've seen in this country. So what can we do about this? This has been one of my real preoccupations since coming here. I do think funding things like civics, funding things like community service initiatives, and also taking a longer term view. So we've launched something called Carnegie Fellows, where we've invited universities to nominate a junior and a senior faculty member who are working on polarization in the US. How do we understand it? How did it come about? And ideally, how do we mitigate it? And so we're very self-consciously mining academia for ideas that will then influence subsequent grant making. So we've selected 30 academics. The first year, we've now started the process of selecting a second cohort. So there's so much to be done in the realm of education for a country, of this wealth. To have so many kids failing in high school or even before high school is such a tragedy. And I do, no doubt, in part because of my own life experience, I believe education is the answer to just about every question. And if so many kids are lose out so early on that I think Carnegie was right to care deeply about it, and I certainly still do too.
Well, yeah, and I saw your press release on the polarization fellows, and I was really struck by some of the really creative and interesting. I mean, there was one in particular who was looking at this sort of notion that there are voters are moderate, but it's politicians who are extreme, and was going to just do a deeper dive on that sort of cliche that to kind of get at the core of that. I'll be very interested to see how that research projects unfold and many others.
Well, I do think there's grounds for optimism there because most of the polling I've seen suggests that there really is what they're calling the exhausted majority, and that the extremes are relatively small on both sides. One fascinating study, I believe, by More in Common on history, teaching history in schools, and what people believe should be taught at schools. And about, there was 7% at extremes on each side, but that's 14%. The rest, there was enormous convergence on what history should be taught at schools. But what was most interesting was that Democrats had a very inaccurate and skewed view of what Republicans thought should be taught at schools. And Republicans had a very skewed view on what history Democrats thought should be taught in schools. So they actually agreed far more than they realized they do. And so that kind of finding gives me grounds for optimism that we can keep the extremes to the sides. And if indeed it is true, and given the nature of the political democratic structures here, very often they encourage playing to the extremes rather than to the center. If it is true that our politicians are more extreme than the voters by and large, let's hope we can redress that.
Well, another project that the corporation has become quite involved in is an initiative called Press Forward. And we actually had an event a couple months ago with John Palfrey, who's the president of the MacArthur Foundation, who is a huge proponent of this. And I know, I mean, he argues that the thing that troubles him most and concerns him the most about our democracy is the fact that, local news coverage has just collapsed in this country. And it's really affected civic life, that people don't have that common framework of just, the ice, when is the ice cream social this weekend or something like that. Talk about your particular interest in the Press Forward initiative.
Well, I applaud John for taking the lead in this, and the MacArthur Foundation and the Knight Foundation both. And we were delighted to be a part of it because, yes, we've seen the complete evisceration of local news. Now, Bob Putnam and other academics have chronicled the kind of collapse of social capital in recent decades in this country, occasioned by changes in the workforce and the nature of work and all the rest of it. But it has meant that we participate much less in our communities, and we know much less about what's happening. When I was growing up, and I'm happy to say, I checked the last time I was at home, there are still 2 local newspapers in the town I grew up in. Well, they're based out of the nearby city of Waterford, which is, a population of maybe 35,000, but enough it sustains 2 local newspapers. So how the local golf team was doing, who's winning the prizes at schools, crimes, although there really aren't any, just all that. So you know what's happening in your community. So you have a sense of belonging to that community. And that, I think, is being eroded, and it's so very damaging. So yes, I applaud this effort to try to invest in local news and help local news outlets become sustainable as a way of trying to rebuild civic life. So all of these initiatives, there's a Trust for Civic Infrastructure, there's Press Forward, our interest in community service and civics and so on, they're all about the same, trying to rekindle this sense of community, which has sustained this country for so long.
I'm also interested in a project you have called Bridging the Gap, which refers to this gap between academics and policymakers. And I saw in one of your talks, you noted, I think it was actually the talk you gave this spring at Johns Hopkins SAIS, in which you noted that particularly in political science, there's almost, in the profession, there's almost a skepticism of work that has a policy relevance.
Mhm.
And it's considered in some way, these are not your words, selling out or dumbing down or something like that. Talk about Bridging the Gap initiative and what you're hoping to advance there.
Well, the Bridging the Gap is designed to reduce the reduce the gap between policy and academia. So to ensure that academic ideas get into policymakers, and also in a way that they can consume them usefully, not filled with esoteric jargon, but actually in a way that can be helpful to policymakers. I do think the two major impediments to this are polarization that we've talked about, and the fact that all the incentives especially in political science, but in academia generally, not the sciences, are to steer clear of applied work. It's somehow seen as less serious. And that's a real tragedy, I think. I mean, I was advised to get out of studying about working on terrorism because it was not serious. Nobody cared. This was in the 1990s. And so I really wish, but I see very little evidence to suggest that political science departments are changing and that they're starting to reward applied work. But this can happen. I mean, it's happened in Britain. There's been a dramatic shift over the past 20 years in the regard held for applied work in the humanities and the social sciences, particularly. It was always the case in the sciences. If you're a medic, you want to cure disease, you want to find vaccines, you want to develop vaccines, you want to figure out how to improve health. But when it comes to political science, we're too busy talking to one another and not talking more broadly to policymakers. So the Bridging the Gap funds people whose work does cross this divide, hence the appeal to us of much of the work carried out by the Carnegie Endowment. Also provides opportunities for graduate students, provides training in how do you write an op-ed, how do you get your work into the public realm. But the real problem is the promotion structure, and we haven't cracked that one yet. And yeah, I wish we could.
You alluded to this earlier in terms of the role of philanthropy, and there's one school of thought. I guess it's been referred to as big bets, which is you get a relatively limited number of initiatives and you go real hard, real heavy over maybe a relatively short period of time and just really try to move the needle. And then another school says more kind of long-term, steady, almost endless investments over time. How do you think about those two schools, and can they be married, or how are they best pursued?
Oh, well, I think there's, philanthropy in this country is the model of the world. It is so diverse. You have individual tech titans and who have just recently made money, want to change the world, and you've got foundations like ours, which have been around for over 100 years. So I think there's room, and none of us have it figured out. So I think there's room for diversity of approach here. One thing I would say is that philanthropy is got to be a long-term game. Even the big bets have to take place over a significant period of time. We're not going to change something like education or the public school system in a year or two. So long-term sustained support, I think, is very important to affect change. But I absolutely understand the desire to make a big bet in one clearly defined area. One has to be prepared, to say didn't work. We tried it, it didn't work. And I think by and large, those who have made these bets are perfectly prepared to take that risk. So given the amount of money available for philanthropy, I think we should be trying all of these different approaches, and there's no kind of competition really between them, I would say.
Let's talk for a minute about just this current moment. And we've made reference to polarization, and I think you have a really valuable perspective, having been here for so long and then being away for 14 years and coming back and basically seeing almost a new country. Um, and I want to read a sentence or two that was in a speech you gave and have you maybe reflect on it. You said, "We have seen the political center is not holding in Western politics. Views once regarded as extreme are becoming normalized. The gap between opposing views of the world is widening." I mean, obviously, this connects very much to the polarization we've been talking about, but what does it take to get that center revived and supported and functioning again?
Well, that's exactly what we're doing. That's precisely what we're trying to do. And so many other foundations as well. We're by no means alone in this. The Hewlett, for example, had this Madison initiative trying to strengthen democracy. The reference itself was, as you may have detected, a reference to the poem by Yeats, "The Center Cannot Hold," written at the time of the revolution, or 1916 rising in Dublin. And he goes on to say, "The good lack all, the bad are filled with passionate intensity. The good lack all conviction, and the bad are filled with passionate intensity. The center cannot hold." So the center must hold, and we need the good to be filled with passionate intensity. And I think our work on polarization and strengthening democracy is designed precisely to try, before it's too late, to rebuild the center.
Right. Well, let's maybe, as we're winding down, talk a little bit about the lessons you've learned in your career. I mean, you've obviously done some remarkable things. Um, for the students who might be listening, what are the big things you have learned? I mean, what would you tell the 17-year-old young lady hitchhiking to university? What you've learned to kind of shape their career and guide how they think about the opportunities that they might be afforded.
Well, first, never underestimate yourself. Let others do that. Go for things. Don't, I would say, jump at every opportunity you see, and make opportunities if you don't see them. Don't assume you won't get something. I mean, I've been surprised by every job I've gotten. I thought I wouldn't appoint me to that job. And but I still applied for them. So I would say seek out every opportunity, and don't be derailed by failure. I mean, it's just part of life, and you learn as much from it as from success. And but I would also say, don't take the world too seriously, and enjoy the process. I worry a little that sometimes the younger generation are so programmed, so planned, and also so desperate to find their passion. And if they can't find this passion, they've somehow failed. I would say, life is a series of explorations and opportunities, and engagement with people, and enjoy that process, and just enjoy the privileges that you have. I mean, I do worry again a little that there's this tendency to victimhood and grievance that has been fairly prominent, much more prominent amongst young people today than I think it has been historically in this country. And I would say, don't give way to that. Don't, because it'll just detract from your enjoyment of life, aside from anything else. Be focusing on grievance. Instead, focus on the positives and the opportunities out there.
Finally, I know that you've said that reading has been a huge uh, force in your life, opening the world up as a youngster. And since I see plenty of books behind you, I suspect most of them are professional ones. I've also read that you love fiction. So when you are able to sort of unplug from work, what sort of reading do you like to do to relax and also to think about the world?
Well, I do read a lot of fiction. It keeps me sane. I have one of the things I do that I enjoy most is that I sit on the board of the Booker Prize Foundation, and that's always an excuse to read a lot of really good fiction. I've just finished reading Colm Tóibín's book, Long Island, which is a sequel to Brooklyn, which I think was fabulous. So, yeah, good literature, really. And there's so much of it out there. I've just ordered this morning before I came to work Sebastian Falk's new book, Seventh Son, but I haven't started reading that yet. I read nonfiction as well. I read Gretchen Whitmer's book yesterday to get more of a sense of her. So yes, I love to read. It's one of life's great pleasures.
Well, I was at a bookstore just over the weekend and I picked up Fintan O'Toole's History or Memoir of Ireland. Have you had a chance to read that?
I absolutely have, and I loved it. I mean, it's very dense for the uninitiated, but we are essentially contemporaries. I think it really captures the evolution of Ireland since the time he and I were born very, very well. I really loved it. I'm forgetting what it's called now, but I really loved it. But I think it might be, if you don't know Ireland well, it might be a little dense.
Okay. Well, Louise, thank you so much for such a terrific conversation and keep up the amazing work at the Carnegie Corporation. I know particularly your work on political polarization is just so critical to the survival of this democracy. I don't think that overstates it. So we will, I know I will follow the work of the scholars and see what ideas they come up with that maybe our institute might be able to work with and help advance.
Thank you very much, John. It's been a pleasure, and greetings to all your students.
Great. Well, thanks to all of you for watching another edition of our series. We will have this interview on our website in the coming days. Please show it to family and friends. And thank you for supporting the Institute. Thank you for keeping the legacy of Paul Simon alive and well. Thanks so much.